Want to welcome all of you this morning to this Empire lecture today. We're very thrilled to have as our next speaker in the Empire Lecture Series, Donald Kinder. I wanted to take a quick moment to introduce him and also myself. I'm David Darmafal from the University of South Carolina, and Professor Kinder's obviously had an enormous influence on the discipline and all of us who study political behavior, and so it's a great thrill to be here today. Donald Kinder is the Philip E. Converse Distinguished University Professor of Political Science, Professor of Psychology by courtesy, Research Professor, Center for Political Studies, Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. His current
title, relatively small person.
His current research interests include rehabilitating the concept of ethnocentrism and
my website is a little out of date.
He has rehabilitated the concept of ethnocentrism, and he is developing a psychological theory of framing, and has done part of that already as well. Today, Professor Kinder will offer an assessment of the consequences of Barack Obama's November 2008 election as U.S. President on Americans' views on race. So please join me in providing a hearty welcome here to Donald Kinder.
Thank you. And thanks to the committee who invited me. When I agreed to participate, which I was happy to do, I had no idea that this room, the Empire Room, used to showcase the likes of Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald. And it's a long, long way we have fallen. And I expect the room was a little more full and probably livelier. Well, maybe not. We'll see. Anyway, the title of my talk is History and Opinion, the Consequences of Obama's Election for American Attitudes on Race. I want to start by carrying you back in time, in particular to the 4th of November, 2008. On that day, the American electorate chose Barack Obama, son of a Kenyan immigrant, to be the 44th President of the United States. In a nation dedicated to liberty and equality in principle, but stained by slavery and discrimination in practice, a black man became president. The purpose of my remarks this morning is to offer an assessment of the consequences of this extraordinary event for American attitudes on race. The event was extraordinary. Everybody said so. The New York Times did. Time magazine, Skip Gates said that the election was a magical transformative moment, the symbolic culmination of the black freedom struggle, the grand achievement of a great collective dream. Hertzberg in the New Yorker, similarly, John McCain in his gracious concession speech, and Barack Obama himself, on the night of his victory, speaking to a crowd of thousands in Grant Park, not far from here, said, among other things, "It's been a long time coming, but tonight, because of what we did on this date, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America." You may remember, as I do, the television coverage of Obama's remarks that night. The cameras were sweeping over an enraptured crowd. Scores of ordinary Americans were emotionally undone by what had taken place. If it was easy in the moment to get carried away, there is no denying the historical significance of the 2008 election. Keep in mind that the election took place in a nation whose founding document strengthened the practice of chattel slavery, in a nation that split apart in horrific, bloody conflict over whether slavery would be permitted in the new territories, in a nation whose legislative assemblies and high courts for 200 years conferred the majesty of law upon discrimination and segregation, in a nation where profound racial inequalities of income and wealth, education, health and safety, of everyday justice persist into the 21st century. In such a nation, a black man became president. And then what? I consider four distinct and politically consequential possibilities, four kinds of change in the American electorate plausibly provoked by Obama's election. The four are, I'll take up in turn, prejudice, the political potency of prejudice, shifts in public opinion over time, and racial polarization of the party system. In each case, I'll take these up in turn, and in each case my strategy is to look for interruptions or discontinuities in ongoing trends that can be plausibly attributed to Obama's election. And for purposes of analysis here, I'm going to rely mainly on the National Election Study and the General Social Survey, especially the panel study carried out by GSS in 2006, 2008, 2010. I'm operating under severe time limitations this morning. This will necessitate skipping pretty scandalously over much detail and justification. I'm going to proceed for the most part simply by announcing results, which is, I have to say, kind of exhilarating. The first item on my agenda is prejudice. The question here is, in the aftermath of Obama's election, did prejudice increase, decrease, or did it remain the same? Now, answering this question is complicated by the fact that there is more than a single variety of prejudice. Elsewhere, I've argued that it is useful to classify types of American race prejudice according to three sets of binary distinctions: between biological and cultural, between cognitive and affective, and between conscious and unconscious. Such variety could make a lot of trouble for us here, but it doesn't. The results converge, and they're easy to summarize. Obama's election seems to have had no impact at all on prejudice. For example, what you see here in these two figures is the movement of racial resentment over time, measured on the left-hand side by the National Election Study and on the right-hand side by the General Social Survey. There's very little movement to see. It's true in both the ANES and in the GSS. Racial resentment is essentially stationary over the last 40 years. And more to the point, it is stationary since 2008. There's no sign here that Obama's presence generated a decrease or an increase in prejudice. And what is true for racial resentment, as you see here, is true as well for other forms of prejudice. Stereotypes, racial affect, the new measures of implicit prejudice all tell the same story. It's a story about prejudice's durability, its tenacity. On then to the second possibility and to the political potency of prejudice. The question here is, in the aftermath of Obama's election, did prejudice become more important in shaping opinion? Going in, I expected that it would, and my confidence in this respect derives from a straightforward observation, I think, and a well-established psychological mechanism. The observation is this: when it comes to political life, nobody gets more attention than the president. And every time that President Obama's face appears on the evening news or on the front page of newspapers, or increasingly in various social media outlets, Americans are reminded that he is black. The well-established, the well-established psychological mechanism is priming. Together, the observation and the mechanism imply that as they form and revise their opinions on policy in the Obama era, white Americans will have their racial sentiments more prominently in mind than they otherwise would. Testing this is kind of tricky. We rely here primarily on the 2006, 2008, 2010 General Social Survey panel study. The study is well suited for our purposes in that the first observation in 2006 took place when the first-term Senator Obama was just beginning to think about the possibility of running for president in 2006. Includes a second observation in the spring of 2008 when Obama and Clinton are fighting over the Democratic nomination, and then draws to completion in 2010 with Obama well into his first term. Our statistical test of priming follows the stringent method developed by Gabe Lentz, and the results are summarized, not there, but there. The table is organized by policies down the first column. There are 8 such policies, from affirmative action on the top to reducing income inequality on the bottom. And in each case, there are 3 values presented. In the left-hand column, labeled before 2006-2008, is the estimated impact of prejudice on change in opinion on policy between 2006 and 2008. That is, before Obama. In the middle column is the parallel analysis. Again, the estimated impact of prejudice on change in opinion on policy, this time between 2008 and 2010, that is, after Obama. And in the right-hand column is the difference between the 2 estimates. A significant difference, more precisely, a significant increase, indicates support for priming. You'll see the table groups the policies, the 8 policies, into 3 sets. The first deals with race explicitly, affirmative action, government aid to blacks. And as you see there, there's no evidence of priming at all. On these matters, prejudice was important before Obama, but equally important afterwards. Evidently, and perhaps not surprisingly, white Americans were already thinking about race when they thought about these policies. Obama made no difference in that respect. The second set, what we're calling race-neutral policy, is comprised of policies we thought would be largely immune to racial priming. Federal spending on education, access to abortion, and protecting the environment. None of these refers to race either explicitly or in code, and as such we expected a small or negligible effect of prejudice and no increase in the effect after Obama becomes president. And as you can see there, that's pretty much what we found. Finally, and the most interesting, perhaps, part of the table is the third set, what we call racializable policies, reforming health care, increasing assistance to the poor, and reducing income inequality. And we thought these would represent good candidates for racial priming. None refers to race. Each might be understood in racial terms. For example, health care reform, or Obamacare as it came to be known, could be understood as giving health care to black people who failed to provide for themselves. Or increasing assistance to the poor might be understood as showering benefits and programs on undeserving black people. Or thirdly, reducing income inequality might be understood as redistributing resources from white makers to black takers. As the table shows, we do see evidence of racial priming here and on all three policies, on health care reform, assistance to the poor, and reducing income inequality. And you might notice that in each case, the effect of prejudice on these matters after Obama becomes president approximates the effect due to prejudice on explicitly racial policies. So, racial priming, yes. A conditional yes, priming on some matters of policy, but not on others. The third possibility we examine takes up the movement of public opinion on government policy. In 2008, as we know, Americans elected a black man president. They also elected a Democrat. While the former was unprecedented, the latter happens from time to time, and we know, at least we think we know, what happens when a Democrat is elected president. The public's preferences on policy move modestly and temporarily to the right. It works in the opposite direction as well. Having elected a Republican, the public's preferences on policy move modestly and temporarily to the left. This is the thermostatic model of opinion change at work, and there's plenty of support for it. The question we raise here, then, is whether Obama provoked an especially strong thermostatic response. To find out, we compared public opinion on policy before and after Obama's election with public opinion on policy before and after the election of Obama's predecessors, starting with John Kennedy, where the evidence gets good. For each elected president, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, George H. Bush, Clinton, Gore, that was a joke, I mean George W. Bush and Obama, we estimate two values, the public's view on policy shortly before their first election and the public's view on policy midway through the president's first term, after the newly elected president has had an opportunity to promote an agenda and the public has had an opportunity to react to it. We're relying here on Stimson's quarterly estimate of opinion on domestic policy, what he calls public mood, and we rescore this to range from 0, which means extremely conservative, to 100, which means extremely liberal. With respect to President Obama, we find the expected effect. That is, after Obama's election, we see a modest and statistically significant shift in public opinion to the right. Between the run-up to Obama's 2008 election and the 2010 midterm, public opinion moved 4.5 points to the right on the 0 to 100 point scale. You can see this here. Obama at the bottom. The table also shows, as you'll see immediately, is that every president we examine, from Kennedy to Obama, generates the expected thermostatic response. After Democrats are elected, public opinion shifts to the right. After Republicans are elected, public opinion shifts to the left. In each instance, the shift is statistically significant. In magnitude, the conservative shift ranged from about 2 points to 9 points. The liberal shift ranges from 3 to 11 points. Obama's score, notice, comes in right at or slightly below the median. This result is robust over alternative measures of the timing of the thermostatic response. We find again and again that reaction against President Obama is middling neither particularly strong nor particularly weak compared to his predecessors. So by these results at least, and in this respect at least, the public seemed to react to Obama as though he was just another president, another Democratic president. That he was also black seemed not to figure into it. Maybe. We know that Obama became president in part because of the disastrous economic conditions prevailing at the time of the election. The country was plunging into a deep recession. Just prior to the November election, the unemployment rate was running slightly under 6%. By the time of the 2000 midterms, it had risen to nearly 10%. On this ground alone, we should expect to see public opinion moving to the left. Increases in unemployment typically generate increases in public support for liberal domestic policies. That is, rising unemployment produces support for programs to help those in need. So the point here is that the thermostatic response to Obama, the shift to the right, was competing against the effect of staggering unemployment, which was pushing public opinion in the opposite direction, pushing it hard. According to the work of Erickson, McEwen, and Stimson in the Macro Polity, a 1-point increase in the unemployment rate generates a liberal shift in public mood on the order of 1.5 points. So on this ground alone, on the ground of rising unemployment, between November of 2008 and November of 2010, public opinion on domestic policy should have moved roughly 5.5 points in a liberal direction. This means that by ignoring the rise in unemployment, we have seriously underestimated the conservative reaction to Obama. In fact, rather than middling, from Kennedy on, Obama becomes the president who provokes the sharpest thermostatic reaction of all. Perhaps the public did notice Obama's race. Finally, the fourth consideration, the fourth possibility, speaks to the racial polarization of the party system. Of course, long before Obama was even thinking about running for president, the political parties were deeply divided by race, for reasons rooted in our history. And in the fall of 2008, black Americans identified overwhelmingly as Democrats. White Americans, meanwhile, were evenly divided in their partisan loyalties. So the relevant question here is whether the American electorate became still more racially polarized after Obama's election. You might think that. Obama, at the very top of the ticket, sends a strong signal about race and party image. Let's take a look. The figure there summarizes partisanship, the movement of partisanship from 1952 on the left to 2012 on the right, separately for blacks and whites as registered on ANES surveys. At the very beginning of the series, in the 1950s, you see modest differences between blacks and whites in party identification, increasing sharply in the 1960s, in the middle of the American racial crisis of the 20th century. And since then, the racial differences increase slightly, primarily because of Americans shifting towards the Republican Party, white Americans shifting towards the Republican Party. The real question here is what happens at the end of the series as Obama steps out onto the national stage. And what happens is that the racial difference in partisanship increases. It increases slightly in 2008 and sharply and statistically significantly in 2012. In fact, the racial divide in partisanship registered in 2012 is the greatest recorded in the entire 60-year history of the NES series. White identification with the Republican Party, as you can see there, is at an all-time high in 2012. And black identification with the Democratic Party in 2012 is exceeded only in the entire series just once, in 1968, at the peak of the racial crisis, shortly after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in the midst of scores of urban riots, and as Governor Wallace of Alabama was harvesting a rich bounty of electoral votes in the Deep South. In short, the political parties were deeply divided by race before Obama. They became even more deeply divided by race after Obama. This seems to me to be an unhappy development. Sociology tells us that polarization threatens social cohesion. It increases enmity, and it converts ordinary disagreement into implacable and irreconcilable conflicts. It says here I'm going to talk about the implications of findings very rapidly, and then a word or two about taking history seriously. So, Obama's election in 2008 was greeted with an explosion of commentary, both at home and abroad, celebrating its significance. This was a moment when history turned, we were told. Obama's victory signaled a generational shift in American politics, so it was said. The election of a black man as president announced to the world that the most painful of all American struggles had finally come to an end. Without challenging the historic importance of Obama's rise to the presidency, my purpose here has been to offer a hard-headed assessment of the consequences of this event for American public opinion. Taken all around, do we see accommodation or do we see backlash? In the aftermath of Obama's election, have we moved closer to or further from a politics in which race carries no weight? The evidence I've presented today seems to me at least to be mixed on this score. For one thing, we find no evidence of an increase in prejudice, and we might well have expected one. Obama's election could have been seen by many whites as a clear threat to their status. According to Bloomer's account of prejudice, an increase in racial animosity should follow accordingly. But it did not. That is not what we see. Consistent with the priming hypothesis, we find prejudice to play a more prominent role in white opinion on policy after Obama than before, but not just on any policy. Thoroughly racialized issues like affirmative action and issues that evade racialization, at least under current conditions, like environmental policy, show no evidence of priming. Priming occurs only for issues like healthcare reform that are not obviously about race, but can be framed and understood to have racial connotations. We found again that after Obama became president, the public shifted to the right on domestic policy, but it remains unclear whether this reaction was out of the ordinary, a consequence of this particular president's extraordinary racial identity. And finally, we did find that the Obama election appeared to accelerate the racial polarization of the American party system. In an unwelcome development, the racial divide over partisanship increased sharply. If the evidence taken all around supports neither a combination nor backlash completely, it does demonstrate, to me, I think, how far we have yet to go before race disappears from our politics. Obama's election and his re-election prove that race, blackness, is no longer categorically disqualifying for the highest office in the land. This seems to me still remarkable and well worth celebrating. But the end of race, not by a long shot. I want to make one last point here, partly to place my effort in a somewhat broader context. This final part starts with Jim Stimson. In the Tides of Consent, Stimson announces the arrival of a new science of public opinion. What he has in mind here is a science devoted to describing and explaining the dynamics of public opinion, the movement of public opinion over time. In a small way here, I have tried to contribute to this new science. One thing we've begun to learn from the science of opinion dynamics is the importance of events. History matters. History, as interpreted by elites, matters. You can see this in the work of Ben Page and Robert Shapiro, in Stimson's many contributions, in the work of Adam Berinsky, and many other places. The new science of public opinion, if it has not fully arrived, is certainly arriving. And as I say, one clear lesson is history matters. Well, sometimes history matters. I think one important item on the new science's agenda is becoming smarter about history. In this endeavor, one might turn naturally enough to the discipline of history. Forever since Herodotus, historians have written about events, battles, alliances, scandals, conquests, conspiracies, revolts, royal successions, reforms, elections, religious revivals, assassinations, discoveries. Momentous events have always been the bread and butter of narrative history. But as William Sewell points out, even in history, the idea of historic event has rarely been subject to theoretical scrutiny. I think we have to do this work ourselves. We have no theory of the event. What we have instead is a set of empirical demonstrations that reveal the power of certain events to affect certain aspects of public opinion in certain ways. Making progress on this front will require theoretical attention paid to history. It will require, one could say, taking history seriously. Thank you.
So we have some time now for some Q&A. I will bring the microphone around if you want to raise your hand.
Hi. My name is Victor Otadi. I'm a psychologist at Loyola here in Chicago. I was wondering if you found any evidence of polarization on your prejudice measure, that perhaps the Obama presidency made some people less prejudice, other people more prejudice, and these two canceled out, producing your sort of null effect.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it is one that we explored and found no evidence for that either. So over time, it's not the case that prejudice moves in level. It's not the case that it moves in variance. It's not the case that it moves in a direction of greater consistency. It's not the case that it moves in a direction of polarization, as you suspected. Could have. I think it's a plausible psychological hypothesis, but it turns out upon examination not to be true.
Hi, Fred Slocum, Minnesota State University, Mankato. I teach a course on Southern politics, and so I'm wondering if any of your additional analyses broke out the subgroup that I'm naturally interested in, white Southerners. Did you find any specific effects or differential effects with your analyses,
Yeah.
if there was any breakdown in separating out white Southerners?
Yeah, that's another really good question, and I have a much less powerful response. Namely, we didn't look at that. Something worth looking at. In some of this analysis, you start running out of cases, but you can do some of it. Some of what I've done here you can do by regional background breakdown, and we should do that. Thank you.
Barry Kay from Wilfrid Laurier University. I was just interested in juxtaposing the phenomenon you're addressing today with the effect of the Kennedy election on the Catholic vote, which 50 years hindsight suggests it killed it. That we know even no longer really even pay attention to that particular demographic. We may have in a couple of years the phenomenon of a woman president and what impact that might have on that vote. But my question is really whether the black experience in terms of electoral politics, how it should be measured compared to other demographics, which in the past have been thought to be barriers as well, like gender, like
Sure.
denomination.
Sure. That's very interesting. The way I started to think about the 2008 election was thinking first about the Kennedy election in 1960, with race playing the role in 2008 that religion played in 1960. And I think the parallel can be taken pretty far. And it is true that the political conflict between Protestants and Catholics certainly diminished after 1960. Does anybody know who the next Catholic nominated by a major party was since? John Kerry, yes. And reading about the 1960 campaign and then reading about the 2004 campaign is living in two different worlds. Insofar as Kerry ran into trouble, it was trouble for his public position on abortion. So he was chastised by a few archbishops who refused to give him communion. But as a general matter, religion was invisible in 2004 in a way that it was front and center in 1960. Had Kennedy lived, we would have seen in 1964 whether that religious divide would have diminished. There was quite a bit of speculation at the time that it would have, that when Kennedy became president, it turned out that the Pope was not dictating foreign policy. It turned out that he was, sort of just another president. Possibly we would have seen a diminished effect of the Catholic-Protestant divide in 1964 had Kennedy lived to run for re-election. The comparison now is in 2012 we ran the experiment. So one question you might have been thinking about is what is the role of race? What is the role of both racial identity among African Americans and the role of racial prejudice among whites? How does the role of race in 2012 compare to its preceding election in 2008? And people have been working on that. I'm working on that. I think it's pretty clear that one thing that happened is that the role of prejudice, measured in different ways, diminished in 2012 compared to 2008. That it was less central. It was still very important, but it was less central in 2012 than in 2008. perhaps for the same kind of reason that people were arguing about Kennedy's ability to diffuse the religious divide. But by comparison, you asked me finally to compare, and race is our most intractable, most persistent, most durable problem. And we've done way better on a lot of things compared to race. I think it's, it has a stickiness that is unparalleled in American political history.
Hello. My question is right here. With regard to theorizing of history, you call the Obama effect like a matter for the study of the history of events, when it seems to me like a matter for the study of history of great men. And
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
history of great men, like a great man view of history. And so
Yes.
I'm curious, do you see a distinction between these two types of enterprises? I mean, should we see an election of a president as something about a man or something, or an event that is changing people's attitudes? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm interested in the category of event, and great men and great women would show up there from time to time, but I think what the evidence indicates so far in this, what Jim Stimson calls the new science of public opinion, the study of opinion dynamics, is that events matter. Things like the Great Depression mattered, the Civil War mattered, it still matters. 9/11, conceivably, by some accounts, mattered. And by this I mean for the study of public opinion, for how people think about politics. The question of consequences of events can be addressed in a whole variety of ways, and I'm only looking at this one little slice of it, which is public reaction, the way it changes, if it does, the way people think about politics. But that said, the category that I'm interested in is event, and I do draw this distinction. I think event is a much bigger category than the theory of great men changing the course of history events, historical events. Do we have to clear the room?
No, we still have a few more minutes. Any additional questions?
Thanks, Don. I question a little bit the idea that racial polarization has become dramatically larger. If you go back to your chart, it looks like the proportion of whites who are Republican has been pretty flat for about 2 decades. Yeah. It went up during the it jumps up during the Reagan administration, about 2004. Mm-hmm. After that, it's pretty much flat. Right. Whereas the gap happens because African Americans become even more democratic than they've been, which is not surprising under the circumstances of a black president. You'd expect that to happen. You wouldn't necessarily expect it to be sustainable after he goes. That is, this is not something, a permanent shift in the distribution. It looks more like a kind of temporary tick to me, guessing forward.
I share your view about this, or at least the plausibility of your view, that this could be a relatively temporary event. I would say that it's impressive to me that you find increasing polarization, given how polarized the parties were going into 2008. That in particular, blacks enlisting in the Democratic Party is a phenomenon that had very little room to be shown because blacks were overwhelmingly Democratic going in. I think it's an interesting question whether this will persist. I think there are a lot of interesting questions about the persistence. One that I didn't speak of, but I'll just mention here, is the sharp increase in turnout among African Americans, which contributed very importantly to Obama's election in 2008, and contrary to my expectation, contributed even more importantly to his re-election in 2012. That his ability to mobilize African Americans into the electorate made a very substantial difference to the outcome. I thought that you'd see it in 2008 and then it would go away, because putting a black man in the White House for the first time is one thing, keeping him there seems like a different thing. I had a big argument with my former colleague, now gone, I'm afraid, Haynes Walton, who knows everything there is to know about black politics. And I said what I said, and he said, you're wrong. What will happen in 2012 is people will start picking on the president in the campaign, and the mobilization effort will accelerate, and blacks will turn out again. And They turned out even in greater numbers than they did in 2008. Does that persist in the absence of a black president? I'd be suspicious of that too. And I guess, I mean, it's lame to say, but we just sort of have to wait and see how this turns out.
Yeah, one interesting thing, I've been looking at how presidents affect their party's image and reputation and so forth, going back to Eisenhower. And it looks like Obama, in general, has a stronger effect on how people respond to various questions about his party, where it stands, what its ideology is. There's
Yeah.
a stronger, larger coefficient for Obama than for other
Well,
presidents.
that's very interesting.
Yeah.
So that suggests that it might be a little stickier than I
Yeah.
was imagining. Michael Tesler has this interesting result on this point, which I had and now has departed my brain. Oh yes, that NES regularly asks this question about where do you stand on whether the government is obliged to provide special assistance to blacks, and then where do the candidates stand? And in 2012, Obama was the furthest left candidate on that issue than any preceding Democrat. And arguably, I don't know, you could find, I suppose, one or two of his predecessors who were in fact to his right on this issue. So there's both the connection between perceptions of Obama and what the Democratic Party really is, and then going into that, feeding into this, is a misperception of who Obama really is.
We have time for one last question.
It's Indrajit from Delhi University of India. My memory basically goes back to my school days when I studied about the story of Muhammad Ali, how he was discriminated in US society. So my basic question is that though the Constitution of India is based on Lockean principles, talks about pursuit of happiness, why person like who are regarded as great, Jefferson and Madison, failed to consider the position of blacks in US society, whereas in India, when Constitution came into existence in 1947, religious minorities and other minorities which were being exploited got right away special rights. But why these people failed, or they didn't want to give any right?
There's noise coming from the lobby, and I didn't really hear the crux of that question. David, did you?
So why were rights not given in the U.S. Constitution when they were in the Indian Constitution? Is that summarizing that? Does that make sense? Did that summarize your point?
Yeah, person like Jefferson and Madison were there. They are
Yes.
going to be very great people.
Yes. They also,
Consider their position.
yes. The fight over slavery in the Constitution is a fight over partly getting enough people to ratify the document in the first place, and the conflict was rooted in the crucial importance of the plantation economy and the slave trade to the southern states. So there had to be some kind of compromise brokered. And the compromise was to not speak of slavery in the Constitution, but in several different ways actually strengthen its practice.
Thanks to Professor Kinder, to Don Kinder here, and please join me in thanking him for this great lecture.